Good afternoon. I want to thank you all for coming. My name is Dan, and I would like to talk with you about solving problems with pictures. Now, before we get started, I just want to take a second to thank Microsoft. Well, in fact, let's make this personal. Is there anybody here who is from Microsoft? I want to thank you personally, you people from Microsoft, not only for putting together this amazing conference, which even on the first day has been fantastic, but even from a more selfish perspective, from asking me to come and share some of my ideas with this group. Today is kind of an exciting day for me, and here's why. For the last 3 years, I have been working on a book, which is called The Back of the Napkin, Solving Problems and Selling Ideas with Pictures. And what's pretty exciting for me, and why I'm really happy to be able to share this with you at Mix, is that yesterday here at the Venetian, I received from Penguin, who is the publisher, the very first box of 20 books. And this is the first time I have actually seen it myself. And I cannot tell you, for those of you who have ever thought about working on a book or have published a book, there is an amazing feeling that you have when you finally see the bloody book. Now, I've got some good news and I've got some bad news about the book. The good news is it is finally available, sort of. The book officially isn't available until March 13th, so another 9 days from now. Some bad news is that between Penguin and Microsoft and myself, we really tried very hard to make sure that each one of you would be able to get a copy of the book. Unfortunately, logistically, it doesn't work out because there simply aren't enough of the books available yet. But that said, as I mentioned, I did receive this box of 20 books. Now, every one of you should have received, and if you haven't, please keep handing them out. Did everyone receive a little postcard? Does everyone have one of these? I handed out about 400 of them in the back. They should be making their way along. Does whoever have them still have the postcards? Are they making their way through? Yes? Yes? Okay. All right. It's little postcard looks like the book. Now, here's the secret. And I'm going to tell this to you. This is probably unfair. No, I'll tell you what, I'm going to wait. I'm going to wait. I'm going to wait a little bit. Okay, so the really good news is that's the last I'm going to talk about my book for the next hour and 15 minutes, thankfully. The bad news is I'm going to spend the next hour and 15 minutes talking about the subtitle of my book, which, as you know, is Solving Problems with Pictures. And you know, whenever I hear myself say that, and believe me, solving problems with pictures, I have heard myself say that a lot of times. Every time I think, that sounds pretty good. That sounds pretty powerful, solving problems with pictures. But immediately it brings up three questions. First, which problems are we talking about? Which problems are we going to solve? Secondly, which pictures are we going to use to solve those problems? And then the third question is, who's we? Who is going to do this? Who are the people that are actually going to use these pictures to solve these problems? Well, I can give you the quick answer for every one of these questions right now. And in fact, this is essentially the agenda for the rest of the talk, answering those three questions. Which problems can we solve with pictures? All of them. I don't exaggerate. We obviously, at Microsoft Mix, are going to be talking specifically about user experience-related problems and business strategy-related problems. But it has been my experience that has been borne out over several years of doing this, that any kind of problem, it can be a resource management problem, a project management problem, a business strategy problem, any kind of problem can be made more clear, if not outright solved, through the use of a picture. And which pictures are we talking about? Are we talking about pictures that require a tremendous amount of artistic talent to create or years of training or sophisticated software? The answer is no. The pictures that we're talking about are nothing more than little arrows and boxes and circles and the ever-treacherous smiley face and the occasional stick figure. If you can draw those, you can draw every one of the pictures we're going to be talking about, which kind of leads us into the third question. Who is going to do this? We are all going to do this. And as we go through the next hour or so, I hope that I'll be able to prove it, that all of us have the ability to do this. I actually want to start for a second with question number 2. I just want to clarify which pictures we're talking about. The kinds of pictures that I like to focus on and I like to talk about with people to use as a true business problem-solving tool are literally back of the napkin kind of pictures, sketches that you can make in a few moments. Now, it's really important to keep in mind that just because you can draw the picture quickly does not mean that you're winging it. It does not mean that you're necessarily making it up on the spot. And that's really a critical point to keep in mind. But the kinds of pictures I want to talk about are not pictures like this, which I did make. I mean, I do make very sophisticated computer graphics if I need to. But that's not the kind of picture that I think is really important for this sort of conversation. It's the picture from which that one originated, which literally it wasn't a napkin, but it was a page from my notebook that I was sitting in an executive meeting with senior executives at Walmart down in Bentonville, Arkansas, and we were trying to plan out how is it possible for Walmart, the world's largest corporation, to clearly communicate to essentially the world's largest buying public, what does it mean when Walmart talks about trying to develop more sustainable business practices and more environmental sustainability within the entire supply chain of Walmart? What does that really mean? And in the end, we created a pretty sophisticated website that has some very nice-looking graphics that look like this. But the really interesting thing is that the problems were solved. This was just execution. The problems were solved through sketches that we made on whiteboards and on notebook paper. Those are the kind of pictures that we're going to be talking about. And for those of you who are user experience designers, and I'd like to just to get a sense of who's here. If we were to divide the world up more or less into three groups of people, user experience people, technology people, and say business people, how many people in here would consider themselves user experience people? Okay, it looks like about a third. How many would be business people? A few less, and I'm assuming the rest of you would, how many technology people? Okay, what I would like to be able to show you for all of those is that the pictures that I'm talking about, this is not the sole domain of designers or of creative people. In fact, on the contrary, the kind of pictures that we're talking about work because they work for all people, whether you are more technology-oriented or whether you're more analytics-oriented. The idea of visual thinking is all about taking advantage of our innate ability to see the things that we are already born with and see both with our eyes and with our mind's eye to be able to discover new ideas, develop them really, really quickly and intuitively, and then share them with other people in a way that other people are simply going to get. So in that idea, although I will spend a little bit of time taking you very quickly through a case study of the creation of a very cool application that I helped build for Microsoft, the point that I really want to talk about is how we got to the end design. And we did all of the wireframing and all of the user experience design, in fact, all of the scenario building and all of the use cases with nothing more than sketches that were done on a whiteboard. Now, partly, and I'll talk about this a little bit later, we had to do that because we were very time constrained, but also we were able to do that and we found it extraordinarily effective in getting people to make decisions very quickly, and we'll talk about that more. But I did just want to emphasize those are the kind of pictures that we're really talking about. Now what I'd like to do is answer that third question. Who is it that's going to be drawing these pictures? Because in a way, this is really the most complicated and kind of controversial question about this whole idea. Every time I walk into a meeting, every time I walk into a seminar or a workshop, guaranteed somebody, if not usually a third of the room, says, you know, Dan, this is wonderful. Visual thinking, that sounds great. Solving problems with pictures, that sounds great. It is not for me. I am not a visual person. Now, is there anybody who might be thinking that, who's in here already, who's thinking, I can't draw, I'm not a visual person? Well, what I usually say to the people who have that comment is, you know, that's fine. I understand that we all have various talents. You know, I can ride a bike, but I'm not Lance Armstrong. You know, but the fact is, I still can get enjoyment and work on my health by riding a bike. And that's the kind of thing that I really like to emphasize, that you're visual enough. If you're visual enough to be able to walk into the room and find a place to sit down without falling down, I swear you are visual enough to understand everything that we're going to talk about, and I guarantee that you will get some value out of some of the tools and rules of visual thinking that we're going to be talking about. Now, what I have learned in a highly non-scientific study conducted over years and years of management consulting and design and user experience work is that in this world, everybody kind of falls into this spectrum of how they think visually. And I like to think of it, on the one side, you have the people that I call the black pen people. Now, these are the folks who just cannot wait when they're in a meeting to run up to the whiteboard and just start drawing something out. They just can't wait to do it. Then, and that represents, again, in my highly unscientific study, that seems to represent, in a typical meeting, about a quarter of the people that are there. About half the people that are there, I give the name the yellow pen, the highlighter people, because what they're really good at, these are the people who are maybe a little bit more reticent. They don't jump up to the whiteboard, but they're pretty intrigued when they see someone else, one of these black pen people, drawing on the whiteboard. And what the yellow pen people are really, really good at doing is after the picture is done or after it starts to come together, they'll stand up and they'll say, you know, I can't draw, but, and then they will go up to the board and start noting the things that they found that were particularly interesting and particularly decisive or influential in the drawing that someone else had made. They're really good at picking up on what are the things that are important. And then we have down here at the far end, and I'm sure there are none of you in this room, the people that I'm going to call the red pen people, who literally, especially in a brainstorming session or some sort of collaborative work session, get really frustrated by the fact that there are people running up to the whiteboard drawing pictures that don't have any idea what they're talking about. And then you have other people in the middle who are going up and adding more onto those pictures who've just told us, admitted that they can't draw, but. And the red pen person is usually the one who finally in the end gets so upset by what they are seeing that after they've been sitting there kind of like this for a while, they walk up to the whiteboard, they tend to erase what's there, and then they draw the diagram that is actually the one that more often than not is probably the best representation of the actual analytic facts of the story that needs to be told. The red pen people, just by virtue of sort of aspects of character, tend to be the most fact-driven and analytic people. They are the ones more often than not that really do have the greatest collection of correct information in their minds, but they're not the ones who feel most comfortable drawing it. So what you have between this whole continuum is the fact that everybody is visual in the way that they think, but they do vary a little bit in how they use that visual thinking. So what I'd like to do now, I'd like to do a little self-assessment summary. This will be very quick. It's just going to take us a couple of minutes, and I'm going to need some help. If I could get two volunteers to come up. I have, of course, this being the back of the napkin, we can't do anything without napkins. I'm just going to deputize you if you would. Could you break that open and hand off to this half of the room? And could I get someone over here? Everybody's going to get a napkin. You might want to take two. There's 500. There should be plenty. These are, by the way, drawing on napkins is not really the secret. It's kind of a nice little shtick, but the fact is napkins tend to be very absorbent. These, for those of you who are interested, Safeway, go to Safeway, Vanity Fair premium napkins. These are the way to go. Anyway, what I'd like you to do, everybody, just hand out, everybody should have at least one. You're going to need it. And I hope everybody has a writing device. It's going to get a little bit messy. Okay, so here's what we're going to do. We're going to do a self-assessment. Now, I am going to state a scenario. There will be 5 of these. And what I'd like you to do, this is going to involve a little bit of math. What I'd like you to do after I read the scenario is pick the answer below that's most appropriate for you and write that number on the back of your napkin. And we're going to do that 5 times, just to give a little preview. So, does everybody understand the instructions? Let's go ahead. Yes? No more napkins? Oh, okay, yes, very simple. Well, let's do one. This is scenario A. I'm going to read the scenario, and then what I want you to do is pick the answer that's most appropriate for you and write the number for the answer on your napkin. So, let's take A. I'm in a whiteboarding session in a conference room that has a big whiteboard. The first thing I want to do is, and now go ahead and read the answer and pick the one that's most appropriate. If you're having a hard time seeing the answers up here on the whiteboard, the same answers are on pages 2 and 3 of the handouts that I handed out earlier. So if you can't read it up here, they should be there. So again, I'm in a brainstorming session in a conference room that has a big whiteboard. The first thing I want to do is has everybody got an answer for scenario A? We're going to move on to scenario B. Someone hands me a pen and asks me to sketch out a particular idea. Anybody not done with number 2? We're going to move on. Here's one. Someone hands me a complicated spreadsheet and asks me to look it over. I first Everybody done with C? We're getting there. Okay, this is the one that's kind of apropos to this conference because on your way home, I suspect that this is entirely possible that this might happen. On the way home from this conference, I see a cute fellow attendee at the airport cafe, or more likely at the slots at the airport. And he or she asks me what I do. Is there anybody who doesn't have an answer yet for this one? One more question to go. And this one's easy since we've all been there. I'm an astronaut floating in space. The first thing I do is okay, we are now done with the exercise. I want to just ask, did anybody notice anything weird as we were going through the numbering? How many people noticed that there was a missing number, a missing letter? I put this in as a little test. This is actually the proof of the pudding is in the eating kind of thing. I have intentionally left out the letter E. And typically when I'm in a room full of designers, nobody notices. When I'm in a room full of project managers, I can't even get to read the headline on this one because someone says, where's E? And so I use this as kind of my test, my litmus test to find out if the answers we're going to get are true. So what we're going to do now, here comes the math part. I want you to total up, add up the 5 numbers that were the answers that you wrote down. And obviously the point here is in this very back of the napkin little exercise, try to determine through these kind of silly questions that actually have some meat to them, what kind of a visual thinker you are. Is there anybody who doesn't understand what we've just done or needs more time or help with the math? Okay, because now we're going to go on to napkin exercise, what do I call it? Exercise 2. I'm going to keep my numbering consistent. And this is the napkin exercise that we're now going to do for the rest of this session. So everybody pull out another napkin or flip to the other side, the back of the napkin that you have. You're not going to know why we're doing this until we get about halfway through, but that's cool. Just bear with me. The first thing I'd like you to do, anybody not have a napkin or something to write on? It doesn't have to be a napkin. Everybody's good? Okay, what I'd like you to do is in the upper left-hand corner, I'd like you to draw a little circle and make it look like yourself and write in a title for that, which is me. We are now starting out our problem-solving picture. I hope everyone was able to do that. Now, what I'd also like you to do is write down next to this whatever your number was from the previous exercise, your 15, your 22, whatever that was. Go ahead and write your number next to it. Everybody with me so far? Step number 2. On the lower left-hand corner, I want you to draw another circle, but this one I want you to make it look like a cloud. Draw a big fluffy cloud, and we're going to give it a name too. And its name is my problem. What we're going to be doing with our little napkin sketch here over the rest of this session is we're going to be figuring out how I can use my napkin to help solve my problem, whatever my problem might be. So let's talk for a moment about a couple of sample problems. I have a whole bunch of different case studies that I love to show. Unfortunately, I can only show 2 of them today, and I was trying to think as I was going through all of them. We could talk about Southwest Airlines, we could talk about Walmart, we could talk about eBay, we could talk about Infosys Consulting. The ones that we're going to talk about are one example of a business strategy problem that was clarified through the use of a napkin sketch, and the other one is a product development problem, challenge, that also was addressed through sketching on napkins and whiteboards. The Business Strategy Challenge, I want to introduce you to an industry that you're probably all very familiar with, and this is the coffee retail industry. Now, these are pure coffee plays. I'm not going to count McDonald's. I'm not going to count Dunkin' Donuts in here. Is there anybody who doesn't know or doesn't have a guess as who might be the largest company in the world that is a pure coffee retailing play? Would it be safe to say that that's probably Starbucks? The answer is yes. Starbucks is the largest pure play coffee retailer. The second largest is a company called Peet's. Has anybody ever heard of Peet's Coffee? Peet's Coffee actually started in Berkeley, and now it's more a West Coast kind of a operation, but it's starting to migrate towards the East Coast and starting to go international as well. Now, here's the interesting thing. Starbucks is #1 in the market, and Peet's Coffee is #2. The number of stores that Starbucks has around the world, let's draw a chart. And let's say that that represents 15,000 stores. Starbucks has, as of right now, roughly 15,000 stores around the world selling coffee. Peet's, the #2. Does anyone want to take a guess how many stores they have? Does anyone want to just shout out a number? 150. I don't even know how many orders of magnitude is that. Is that 3 orders of magnitude less? 2 orders of magnitude, thank goodness. Because I would know that because I could add in 2 more zeros. Well, here's the opportunity then from the CEO of Peet's. It would appear that if you're a coffee pure play retailer, there is opportunity for growth. And of course, there is. So now here's the challenge, though. What's really interesting, and I don't want to go into too much of the history of coffee, Peet's started in the mid-1960s, as I mentioned, in Berkeley. The founders and the original roasters of Starbucks were trained and worked originally at Peet's, then headed up to Seattle and started Starbucks. Peet's has been known forever as the best quality coffee in the world. And apparently that's true. It continually wins all the awards and this kind of thing. But now here's the deal. So if you've got a company that has eternally been known for quality, but you have the opportunity for growth, how do you go about conveying to everyone what your growth strategy is going to be? You've got a lot of things that you need to take into consideration. You've got your strategic vision to worry about. You've got your company vision to worry about. You've got a new operating philosophy. Because here's an interesting thing about people who are the employees of a company like Starbucks or Peet's. Has anybody here ever worked for Starbucks or worked for Peet's Coffee? This is something that I didn't realize until I started working with Peet's, is they think about their staffs and their employees differently, because people who come to work for Peet's typically are not professional baristas. People are there in a transition in their lives. People may stay at Peet's or Starbucks for years and years and years and may make a profession out of it, but for most of the people, they're passing through the company. They're not going to be there for a tremendous amount of time, which is very different than people, for the most part, who are working in a professional services company or a technology company. And so what you really need to think about is that, it's one thing for Microsoft to talk about its vision. And as we saw with Ozzy this morning and Scott talking about where are we going as a company, it makes sense when they talk about the big picture and they talk about the vision, because one way or another, we are all invested in that future, either as users of Microsoft products or employees of Microsoft or developers for Microsoft. That's not conceptually the same thing necessarily for people who are pulling coffee or wiping up the counters at Peet's. They don't have the same level of investment necessarily in the company. So what the CEO did is he said, I want to make it really clear, and I really love this email that he's told me it's okay for me to show. An email that was sent to me where he was talking to the head of training, because obviously as Peet's starts to fine-tune what its vision and its mission is, how is that going to be articulated down to the level of the person who's wiping the counters off? And what the CEO was saying is, I found myself wanting the big picture of what's a role, what's a position, and what's the difference. I think this could be done in a picture much better than with lots of words. And this note was forwarded on to me by a former client of mine who was at Peet's, who then said, Dan, I think there might be an opportunity for you to come in and do some consulting work, because look at this. As part of making things simpler to understand and communicate, we think we need to shift the balance of communication from words to pictures whenever possible and make sure we convey the big picture, et cetera. So what we did, we were able to define the entire strategy, growth strategy of the company on the back of a napkin. Now, we didn't do it in 2 minutes. We actually did it over a period of months. And we did it with lots and lots of input. But the fundamental idea was, is it possible to come up with an understanding of the vision and the mission of the company that is so easy to articulate visually, that is so clear, that it could be conveyed on the back of a napkin, it could be conveyed to anybody at the company, and they would understand what their role within the mission and the vision really means. And so the vision of Pete's is always to maintain the gold standard of quality. It will never lose that. That is the vision. The mission is to say, we want that to be recognized, and we want to build a great public out there that understands and knows the taste of good quality coffee, that are connoisseurs of coffee, that love coffee, and recognize that we are the gold standard. Now, how are we going to do that? How are we, as we're drilling down from vision into the retail operating philosophy, what essentially the CEO said is, I want to break down my operation into 4 pieces. And one of those pieces will be the people who are serving the coffee, the people who have direct customer contact on a day-to-day basis. Another part will be the people who are responsible for developing all of our staff, so HR and training. Another part will be the managers, the people who are responsible for managing the stores and everybody else on a day-to-day basis. And last will be the people who are responsible for inspiring. Now, the interesting thing is, you can't show it all on a napkin, but we've been able to summarize the 4 fundamental pieces that need to be focused on from a training and a development perspective. And then what happens is, there is a second napkin, which I can't show you, that then goes off to say, what are all, from a training perspective and from an operational perspective, what are all the specific things that someone who's in the serving quadrant must do on a daily basis, on a weekly basis, and so on. But what I really love about the idea is that you're able to summarize essentially the growth strategy and the operating strategy for an entire business on the back of a napkin. And given the fact that it's Pete's, the back of a napkin is kind of appropriate. The next problem I want to talk about is more the product development problem. Move to another company. That company would be, of course, Microsoft. And you have to ask yourselves, the work that I've done with Microsoft has been with the finance group. So this is Chris Liddell's group, the CFO. In particular with a guy named B.J. Moore and Joel Creekmore. I don't know if anybody knows any of these characters, but they're pretty interesting people. They're in the Microsoft finance side, so they're not in product development. And it turns out that at Microsoft, I'm not giving away anything secret by saying this, there are about 2,500 people whose daily job is to analyze stuff that looks like this. Financial analysts within Microsoft. Now, the question kind of begs to be asked, Microsoft is not in the business of hiring financial analysts just because it wants to create work for financial analysts. The people are there because they need to be crunching this tremendous amount of financial data that's being generated every single day in order to determine what happened financially with previously released products and services so that we can understand what's happening in the market right now, so that we can understand better what's likely to happen, so that we can make better strategic decisions about where to take the business. Now, here's what happened. Okay, there's going to be 2 stories I'm going to tell you here. I'm going to tell you the story, and I'm going to tell you kind of the meta story at the same time. The task was given to a small team of people to try to come up with a demo of an application that would be built using Blend in the end, as strictly as a demo, that might help those financial analysts be able to more quickly and effectively understand what is the broad range of data they have in front of them, to be able to parse it more rapidly, to be able to draw out the insights that are important in order to form good strategy moving forward. So what we did is, typically, for those of you who are user research people or user experience people, you know that the right way to do this would have been to do a tremendous amount of research, talk to as many financial analysts as we possibly could have, and spent a tremendous amount of time understanding exactly what these people look at, exactly what data they need, and exactly how it's going to be reported. Unfortunately, we didn't have that time. So what I suggested is, instead, why don't we just get a big room with a big whiteboard and bring in a half dozen or a dozen financial analysts, these experts, and have a whiteboarding session and figure out what actually happens. And that's what we did. And in a couple of hours, we were able to map out on the whiteboard, I'm going to actually show you how it went together, what I kind of loosely title the financial analysis paralysis cycle. And here's the way basically things work. Our cast of characters is the CFO, and in this particular case, a couple of presidents. At various business divisions within Microsoft, presidents are the people who run those business divisions. So that's our main cast. Now, think about this. The same way that the first picture you drew on your napkin was a little picture of yourself, I always find it effective. The first thing to draw on any one of these pictures is establish who's the cast. First, lay out the who and draw a little picture of the who. And then you can go on, all kinds of interesting things will start to happen. So I'm going to go through this a little bit quickly. But here's the scenario. On a quarterly basis, the CFO calls together these presidents of the different business divisions and says, I want to understand what is the rhythm of business. I really like that term, the ROB. What is the rhythm of business that we've seen in your particular business over the last quarter? And I want you to show me a whole bunch of different metrics, P&L, operating expenses, contribution margin, KPIs, key performance indicators, what have you. And of course, President number one will say, well, we had a great quarter last quarter, but next quarter's not going to look very good. And President number two will say, oh, we had a terrible quarter last quarter, but next quarter's going to look really great. Okay, so the reports are coming in on this quarterly basis. That's fine. Then the CFO looks at these reports and he says, wait a minute, guys. You're not comparing the same things. Your metrics don't match. What you're saying meant for a bad quarter doesn't necessarily compute to what makes for a good quarter. What we need is we need to have metrics that really match. Listen, I need you to go back out there and I need you to do three things. I want you to come up with metrics that match so that we can have better backward-looking analysis so that we can have better forward-looking insight. Come back when you can give me that. The door gets slammed. Well, you can imagine what happens. Our two presidents go off and they say, oh my God, what can we do? And one option would be, and this is not necessarily in any way against Microsoft, this happens at every company. One of the presidents will say, I have an idea. Let's just collect everything and show him everything and let him figure out what of all of that is most interesting to look at. Because look at how many of these metrics that we've got. So this what might happen is all of a sudden on a quarterly basis, here comes a huge stock of documents. Here's all the stuff. You go through it. And of course, the cycle then starts all over again. Now imagine if we changed the way that this works a little bit. And instead, we came up with an option 4B. Where instead of one of the presidents saying to the other, well, why don't we just give him everything and let him figure it out? They say, wait, let's build a tool where he can choose what to look at. I mean, okay, that makes good sense. Now, what's going to be the outcome of that is all of a sudden we'll have a tool where the CFO essentially can see all the information that we have, but it's been formatted and packaged in such a way that the level of detail is variable. It's possible to look at this data from any number of different points of view so that we as the presidents don't always have to figure out what's most important to show. We'll let the CFO figure out what he wants to show and drill down on any level that's appropriate. Now, it turns out, when you start to do this analysis, that in the end, there are really only three ways of slicing all of this data. There's really only three things that at the most superficial level the analyst needs to know. One is they need to know what are all the financial drivers. So we always looked at those. What's profit and loss? What are our operating expenses? What are our head count? Those types of things. That's sort of data slice number one. Data slice number two is what's the date cut? What's the period of time that I'm looking at? Am I looking at quarter to date? Am I looking at last week? Am I looking at year to date? Am I looking at the last 5 years? Am I projecting forward modeling for the next 3 years? What is the date cut? And then the last part is what is the organizational unit that I'm interested in? So of all the data that's out there, in the end, this really becomes, again, the nice little sweet spot. So again, with a little picture, a little Venn diagram map, we've been able to narrow in what do we need to achieve. We need to come up with an intersection of these 3 points of data. So what we were then able to do, and granted this is pretty sophisticated for a napkin sketch, but this is real. We ended up saying, well, for those 3 things, what does the data look like? And we mapped out every potential screen on a whiteboard. We didn't use any sophisticated tools other than what we were essentially born with. And we were able to say, well, if typical data looks like this, what would happen if we were able to create several windows, one of which would provide the geographic view, one of which would provide, let's say we made a kind of a heat map, an organizational structured map that shows relative revenue or P&L or whatever it is that you'd like to look at, essentially creating, yes, a kind of a digital dashboard, an executive dashboard, but one that based on the tools that are available is highly flexible. And each time that you want to look at it at a visual version, you have that option. If you want to look at the underlying data, you can do that as well. And so that's what we were able to do, and in the end, we created our demo, and I can't show more than this particular screen, but we did create a really pretty cool demo. We did it in a matter of a few weeks, and we used Expression Blend to create it. Now, the really interesting thing about this, so that's kind of the story, but what I also want to relate is the importance of drawing these pictures by hand. Because if you remember going back to that kind of cartoon-like scenario that we'd used to map out what is sort of the use case of the whole financial analytics cycle, again, all that happened was we had drawn that on a whiteboard, essentially as you'd seen it, and then when the meeting was done with the experts, I just took a photo of what was drawn on the whiteboard and simply threw it into PowerPoint. That was it. I didn't redraw anything. I really liked the fact that there was this kind of human touch to it. It looked like the drawing wasn't perfect. And a really amazing thing happened, because when we had our executive presentation and review of the work done to date, it was a little bit of a risk. But we said, why don't we just show them the actual pictures that we drew? Because they are highly imperfect. And a really marvelous thing happened is that the level of conversation we had stayed at exactly the level we needed it to, which was the big picture. Because the drawing wasn't finished, and because the drawing wasn't polished, when we showed it to the executives, they were willing to participate in understanding the spirit of what had gone into the picture, and we didn't have a conversation that drove into details that were either too esoteric or too unimportant at the big picture level. And it was quite miraculous. And really, a tremendous breakthrough for me was actually creating the wireframes as hand-drawn pictures. As weird as this might sound, I scanned them in, I just threw them into HTML and made them semi-clickable. And what would actually happen is you would click through the demo on pages that looked like this. They were this detail-free, and everybody got the concept. Everybody understood exactly what we're talking about. I mean, this is a little heat map, of the company. Everybody got it. And in the end, we were able to make it. Now, the really funny story here is that when we were done with the executive meeting, which went really, really well, one of the executives came up to me afterwards and he said, I really liked the way that meeting was put together, and I really liked those drawings that you had used to sort of map out the use case. What was the software you'd used to create those pictures? And I thought the executive was being a little bit facetious. So I said, oh, that's Gray Matter 1.0 and Pen and Paper 1.0. And he said to me, who makes that? And I don't mean in any way to denigrate Microsoft, because I'm so pleased to see that they were giving us the opportunity to actually prove that this would work. And in fact, if this application ever gets built, I don't know, it would be fascinating to be able to go back and say that it was essentially started by drawing on paper. But the point I like to make is that we do have a tendency, especially I would say in this crowd, to believe that we must always use the software tools that are available on the machines because we have them. The fact is, the software that's on the machines is just a figment of what our own innate capabilities are. We all know this. And the really remarkable thing, the magic thing that happens when you are doing quick sketches in a meeting situation in particular, and it really is magic that takes place. Try it sometime. The next time you have to do a meeting, forgive me for saying so, can the PowerPoint, bring in a piece of paper, and you already have your idea worked out in your mind, but draw it out, and you will see participation from the other people that is virtually impossible to do when you have a polished, finished presentation right from the beginning. It's pretty remarkable stuff. Okay, now, what I'd like to do, remember that napkin we were working on? Everybody still has their napkin. I want to help you create what I think of as kind of the universal problem-solving toolkit of visual thinking. And this, believe it or not, the things that we're going to go through for the remainder of this session are the series of very basic tools that I always use when I'm creating one of these kinds of sketches. And I know that you can do the same thing. So what I'd like to do is continue. We're going to draw in the middle our third circle, only this one's going to look a little bit more like a hot dog, something like that. Now remember, what we're making is the universal visual thinking problem-solving toolkit. You're all going to recognize this in a moment because we're going to add a little plus symbol right here. And then you can put a little ring around it. Does everybody recognize a Swiss Army knife? You got to put the little toothpick in the bottom there too. I came up with this idea of saying, well, why don't I just think about visual thinking as a kind of a Swiss Army knife? You all know what a Swiss Army knife is. The idea that, you can be stuck in the woods, you can battle a grizzly bear, you can take apart a computer, you can do anything you need to, you can repair the plane in flight with your Swiss Army knife. So I thought, every time I go into a meeting, I want to have a Swiss Army knife. Now, because I travel a lot, I'm not allowed to carry it on the plane, so it has to be a virtual Swiss Army knife, so it's on the back of a napkin. Well, now here's what we're going to do. I want you to draw this out with me, and you'll see how these pieces come together as we go. On this Swiss Army knife, there are 4 sets of blades. And for the next few minutes, we're going to go all the way around the Swiss Army knife, adding in all the blades in the 4 sets. So what I'd like you to do is add in 3 blades up here. And these are what I call our built-in tools. These are the built-in tools that we have that we can bring to any problem that we face from a visual thinking perspective, and they are our eyes, our mind's eye, and our hands and eyes. Okay, pretty straightforward. We're not going to talk much about these other than to say that we've all got them. Most people have them. Sure, there are people who don't have working eyes. You know what? They still have an incredible working mind's eye. They still have the ability to be able to create things with hands and eyes. We all have this ability. In fact, from a scientific perspective, you probably know this. Maybe you know this. Well over half the neurons in our brains that are focused on the processing of sensory information are focused on vision. Vision is something that is our first and our primary, as little infants, when we're first born, it is our primary mechanism for understanding the world around us. Yes, smell is important. Yes, a sense of balance is important. But vision is we are visual creatures. All of us are. And the amazing thing, the proof of this is if you walk into a kindergarten class where there are a bunch of 6-year-olds, and, with the teacher's permission, of course, if you were to ask those 6-year-olds, how many of them can draw? They will all raise their hand. You ask them how many can dance. They will all raise their hand. How many can read? Maybe 2 will raise their hand. Now you come back to that same group 10 years later when they're 16 years old, when they're in 10th grade, and you ask the same group of people, how many of you can draw? 3 will raise their hand. How many can sing? 2 will raise their hand. How many can read? Everyone will raise their hand. Now there's nothing wrong with reading. But clearly something happens in what we emphasize. We do not spend any time, and I think it's a real shame, we do not spend any time building up the incredible built-in system that we already have of processing information visually. I liken it to all of us being given a really incredible desktop supercomputer at birth. And yet we never load any new software on it from a vision perspective. We never improve the abilities that we're born with. So that's what this is all about. Anyway, there are lots of ways to do it, and if you want to know more, the book will be out in 9 days. Anyway, I do now want to draw 4 more blades down here, and these are the 4 blades of the process of visual thinking. And then remember, this is a business book, and anything that's business-related must have a process behind it. So the process is looking, seeing, imagining, and showing. Now, this is kind of appropriate given the fact that we're in Vegas, because the analogy I really like to give with people, in fact, when I do a full-day work session, I actually have everybody start out by playing a couple of hands of poker. And I don't tell people why we're doing it until we've played a couple of hands of Texas Hold'em. And it's really a good icebreaker. It's a good way to get the team started. It's a good way to confuse people right from the beginning, which can be kind of exciting. But when I'm done, I ask people, why do you think we just played a couple of hands of poker? And it would be great if we could do it here. We'll have to do it at the casino later. But think about what happens. Is there anybody here who has never played a game of cards? Okay, so we've got a good grounding. I see maybe one hand. What happens when you're playing a game of cards? The first thing that happens is you're dealt the cards, and you have to look at them. This is prior to making any sort of value judgment. Before you've looked at the cards, you cannot guess whether you're going to win or not. The first thing you have to do is you have to simply get the information in. You have to look. Fair enough. That's kind of the process of just scanning what's out there. There it is. There are cards in front of me. There are 5 in my hand. Then I see the patterns that are in those cards. I see the colors. I see the fact that some of them are kings and some of them are jacks or some of them are queens or some of them are numbers. But I see the patterns. And it's more than just a semantic difference between looking, which is just kind of the passive act of scanning to let the environment come in, and seeing, which is a highly active, highly filtered process that humans are extraordinarily good at and computers really suck at, which is pattern recognition, visual pattern recognition. We are extraordinarily good at it. Now, the next thing that happens, again, we've got those cards in our hands. Now we're playing poker. We don't know all of the cards that everybody else has. And so what happens is then our mind starts to say, well, based on the patterns that I have seen, I start to imagine how I might be able to manipulate those patterns to try to get something interesting out of them. And secondly, I start to imagine, based on a whole bunch of other visual cues going on around the table, what are the cards that you're likely to have? I'm imagining what is it going to take me to win. I'm imagining what it's going to take me to beat you. I am essentially seeing things that aren't in front of me. What your mind is doing is it's saying, gosh, imagine that I've got, an ace, a 2, a 3, a 4. What would be the next card? Your mind sees it. It says, oh, I need a 5 to finish out the pattern. That's the imagining part, and we're all extraordinarily good at that too. And then in the end, after you've imagined really well and hopefully you had some good cards, finally comes the part where you show. It's the last step. And let's face it, you can't win a game of poker unless you're an incredibly good bluffer. You can't win a game of poker unless you get to the point where you finally have to show the patterns that have emerged and that you have created. Okay, so it's a nice little example. Now, the reason I really like to emphasize this, the fact that there's a process here and it's a simple process and we already know every step, is because it is my experience that the big reason why many people are very uncertain about how to solve problems with pictures is because most people are really uncertain about their ability to draw. And it's a huge mistake because drawing is, metaphorically, only the last piece of this whole showing process. What good visual thinking is about, let me rephrase that. Good visual thinking is not about good drawing. Drawing only comes at the very end. What good visual thinking is about is getting better at looking and seeing and imagining in a visual perspective and then being able to show. And guaranteed for people who are concerned about their ability to draw, if we practice getting better at looking at the world and seeing the patterns that are there and imagining how to manipulate those patterns, guaranteed the better drawing will follow. It can't be avoided. It will happen. Drawing is simply our last step expression of what we already looked at and saw. Okay, so fair enough. That's our process. I summarize it like this. 4 little napkins, looking, seeing, imagining, and showing. This is in your handout if you want to look at any more of the details that are in there in that process. Okay, now, we all know that the most important part of our Swiss Army knife is the corkscrew. Because let's face it, if we're fighting a grizzly bear or we've got to rebuild the airplane in flight, the one thing we need to be able to do is open up our bottle of whatever it is that we have to drink. So on the 5th step, I put in this corkscrew that has five twists to it. Now we're going to do a weird little visualization game for a moment. What I would like you to do is imagine that you are on a beautiful tropical island in the South Seas. You've finally taken a vacation, the vacation that you've owed yourself forever. You finally decided to go, and there you are on this incredibly gorgeous, beautiful day, walking along this white sand beach with turquoise water, palm trees on one side, and then you see walking towards you, coming this way, is a local islander. And this person is walking towards you. And now this is a very, very friendly island, keep in mind. But it's important also to keep in mind that this is an island where they do not speak English. In fact, on this island, they don't speak any language that you speak. Now, what you notice is that this local islander is carrying this really weird little purple fruit. But this, again, is a very friendly island. And as the local islander comes up to you, they're eating this fruit, and they kind of say, nod hello. And they indicate that they've got another one of these purple fruit, and they suggest that maybe you might want to take a bite. And again, you're on vacation. What else are you going to do? Why not? So you take this purple fruit, and you take a bite. Y'all with me on this visualization exercise so far? And you taste this purple fruit, and you say, wow, that's pretty good. It tastes like an apple, only sweeter. And it's interesting because an apple is my favorite fruit back home. So I would like to reciprocate. This local islander has given me their fruit. I want to reciprocate and share them something about an apple, which is my favorite fruit. Now think about the limitations I have, though, to communicate this. I can't speak to this person because we don't have any spoken language in common. There are no apples or anything around that look like apples, but I'm very clever because in the back of my back pocket, I have some napkins from the resort that I'm staying on the other side of the island, and I happen to have a pen. And so what I do is I say, I'm going to draw the apple for this islander. And the first thing you do is you say, okay, how would I draw an apple? Well, what's a nice simple way to draw an apple? And I might just draw something like that. I say, okay, but that doesn't make any sense. The person's not going to be able to understand that. It's way too simple. There are a lot of trees around here. Maybe what I should really do is draw a picture that indicates that apples grow on trees. And in fact, they actually normally grow in orchards where there's lots of trees. So maybe a picture that's a little bit more elaborate. And I'll say, well, no, that's not really going to make any much sense. What I really need to do is focus on sort of the qualitative apple aspects of what makes an apple really an apple. So maybe I can go in here and show the fact that an apple's kind of red, and it's round, And what are the qualities that really make an apple an apple? It's got a little reflection on it. Doesn't that look like a lovely apple? And it's got the little stem there. And I think that's a beautiful qualitative picture of an apple. But that doesn't tell me anything about the saying we have that an apple a day keeps the doctor away. Now, why does an apple a day keep the doctor away? Well, maybe we need to show our apple from a more quantitative perspective. And what would be a way that you could show an apple from a quantitative perspective? Well, what would happen if we mapped out our apple on a chart of U.S. recommended daily allowances of vitamin C and, say, malic acid, or folic acid and vitamin E. And what we'd find out is that from 100% down to 0%, an apple a day does give us about 100% of what we need in vitamin C. It doesn't give us very much vitamin E, but it gives us a pretty good amount of malic acid as well. So they've got a nice quantitative view. And I'm thinking, well, wait a minute, I'm talking to this island. That's not going to make any sense to them. What I really need to do is I really need to show them why I love apples so much. What is the vision of an apple in its most perfect form? What is the vision that we want to achieve with our apple? Does anybody have any idea? Does anybody have any suggestion of how we might draw the vision of a perfect apple? Eating one? Okay. I'm going to do very often. I'm going to take a different tack. Very often what I find when I ask this question is people, they think for a minute and they say, oh, apple pie. An apple in its most perfect form is an apple pie. So what I could draw for my islander is I could draw a nice little apple pie. And it's got nice little scent lines coming off it like that. And I'd say, that doesn't make any sense. The person's not going to understand what I'm talking about this vision. What I really need to show is how do you make an apple pie? And the way that you make an apple pie is you start out with an apple, and you take a little knife, and you slice the apple up, and then you make a crust, and then you put the crust in a pan, and you put all these things together, and then you put it in the oven at 350 degrees for what, 45 minutes or so, I guess, and then after it's cooked, then you put it on the windowsill and let it cool. And that's the way you go about it. And you say, well, that's not going to make any sense. I've gotten way off track here. And there is a punchline. We're almost done. What I could do is, what I probably should do since I'm describing an apple is I should probably spend some time really going into the details, almost the scientific details of the apple all by itself. And it's got a kind of a skin on it, and it's got a certain, and you know how an apple's got this interesting difference in sort of the flesh in here, and then it's got its seeds in the middle. I could actually make kind of a really nicely detailed, super detailed sort of schematic of the apple. I said, well, that doesn't make any sense. The person's never seen an apple before. What I really need to do is show the apple in comparison to maybe some other fruits that they are familiar with. And maybe let's make kind of a pineapple here. So what I really want to do is make a comparison. In fact, here's that crazy purple fruit that they were eating from the beginning. And I'd say, my goodness, where am I going with this? Because I've got so many. What I really want to show is, I want to show how an apple can change. And so if my apple started like this is what change might look like. This is what my apple is going to look like when it's done. But then, the status quo of my apple is kind of back to where I started again. And, thankfully, this exercise is done. Now, here's what we've just done. This is an exercise that represents the 5 twists on the corkscrew. Things are getting real metaphorical here. I call this the squid exercise, and the reason is this. What we've just done is we have literally activated, in this process, we have literally activated every corner of our mind's eye. You've heard about right brain and left brain. Do people know about this, the concept that our right brain and our left hemispheres of our neocortex process information differently? By going through this exercise, we have not only activated all of our centers on our right brain, we've also activated all of our centers on our left brain. Now, what am I talking about? I mean this. We drew a simple picture of an apple. We drew an elaborate picture of an apple. We drew a qualitative picture of an apple. We drew a quantitative picture of an apple. We drew a visionary picture of an apple. And we drew an execution-oriented picture of an apple. We drew an individual, detailed view of our apple. And we drew a comparison of our apple. Then we drew a changed version of our apple, delta, representing change. And we drew, again, our status quo. Now, what all that means when we add it all together is the 5 letters, the squid. I need this because I have a terrible memory. And I need to be able to recall what are the questions that I need to ask myself when I have an idea in mind. And I came up with this silly little mnemonic, which really sticks because it's so weird, which is the squid. Now, it's kind of a classic squid because we have V for vision. But the idea is, of course, when you have an idea in mind, there are two ways to use this squid tool. One of them is that when you have an idea in mind, something in your mind's eye, think about the squid exercise as kind of an applied way to make your imagination really kick in and start to think about different things. And so by simply virtue of the fact of taking your original idea, it could be anything. It could be an apple, it could be a car, it doesn't matter. It's a concept, it's a business idea. And force yourself to come up with a simple view of that, and an elaborate view, and a qualitative view, and a quantitative view, and a visionary view, and so on. And you can't help it. By the time you're done, you will have come up with a whole bunch of ideas about that single idea that you started out with that you never would have come up with had you not gone through the exercise. I mean, it is really, if you try it sometime, it's this crazy experience where you can literally, as you're asking, what's the difference between a qualitative view and an individual view, you will feel the gears in your mind shifting. You will feel stripping of gears in your mind as you shift from one way of thinking about something to the next way of thinking about it. Now, the second thing, and this is what's really interesting about this squid exercise as well. You know, the most important part about creating these pictures is not only to help us come up with our good ideas, but remember the whole point here was we wanted to explain our apple to this local islander. A really fascinating thing happens when you've got this idea in mind. Put yourself in the shoes of the person that you're going to be showing it to, and ask yourself, which of these views is going to be most interesting to my audience? And the example I'd like to give is this. Let's say you and your team have got a really great concept for a new product, and somehow through the grapevine, the CEO of your company has heard about this and invites you into their room and says, listen, I'm in the process of doing my budgeting right now. I've heard that you've got a great idea. You've got 5 minutes to explain to me what your idea is about. Now ask yourself, do you want to make an elaborate, quantitative, execution-oriented comparison for your CEO? No. What you want to be able to do is make something which is very simple, which is very qualitative, which is visionary, which is probably individual, and more likely than not shows change. And more likely than that, that is probably going to be a simple drawing like a Venn diagram or something. But now let's say that the CEO says, great, I love it, you're funded. Go talk to the head of the project management group to figure out how you're going to allocate your resources and how you're going to build it. Not my problem, the CEO. Go talk to the head of product development. Now, when you go talk to the head of the product development and say, we've just gotten our $5 million, we're going to be working on our product. The head of project development is not going to want a simple qualitative visionary vision. What they want to know is, how are we going to execute this thing? They want to know quantitatively, what are we going to do and how many people is it going to take and how long is it going to take to do it. Point being, it's a very different picture of the same apple. Anyway, does everybody kind of understand that? Is there anybody who doesn't really understand that example? If I'm understanding this clock right, is this telling us that we have 17 more minutes to go? Is that what that means? I'm really terrible at keeping track of time in this. I'd like to spend just a couple of minutes, because I would like to leave a little bit of time at the end for questions if you'd like. I want to really quickly run through some examples of using the squid with a bunch of different business ideas that have been out there, just to show you a little bit more reality of what I'm talking about. Has anybody ever heard of a guy named Jeff Hawkins? Jeff Hawkins, founder of Palm Computing, developer of the Trio, now has a company called Numenta. Jeff Hawkins, pretty fascinating guy, kind of a serial entrepreneur, millionaire, multimillionaire. What he has found, what Jeff Hawkins essentially is up to now with his company Numenta, is trying to understand why artificial intelligence has not worked. Why has artificial intelligence not met anyone's expectations of what we thought computers would be able to do 20 years ago or even 10 years ago? And in his mind, it's because we've never defined well what intelligence is. And what we have tended to do, people who are involved in artificial intelligence, again, in Jeff Hawkins' point of view, is tend to look at the result of human intelligence and try to get computers to emulate the same result. And what he says is that means we are destined to failure going down that path. What we need to do is we need to figure out what intelligence really means. If we understand what intelligence means, then we can start to make machines that aren't emulating the result, but they're emulating the process. The point of all this is Jeff Hawkins travels around the world now giving talks to raise money and awareness about the software that he is developing and just the basics of neurology and neuroscience. And what he does is he essentially has two different pictures that he shows people. Sometimes, say for example, if he's talking to music students at the Juilliard School of Music in New York, he has to show them a really simple model of how the human brain works. and essentially says what happens is our senses pick up information about what's around us in the world. It gets processed through our reptilian brain, our brain stem. From there it gets passed on into our neocortex, gets processed, and gets spit back out in the form of behaviors. That's the way the brain works. Fine, people get it. Now, if Jeff Hawkins is going to go talk to neuroscientists at the Johns Hopkins Institute, Johns Hopkins School of Medicine, or at MIT, there is no way that he can get in the door by telling that picture. So what he does with that group is he draws what is essentially exactly the same picture. It's just infinitely more elaborate. And this is, in fact, from Van Essen, who is a neuroscientist who has spent a tremendous amount of time mapping out how the human mind really does work, a diagram that, interestingly enough, is composed of exactly the same types of pieces, lines and boxes and squares, and it essentially shows the same things. So when Hawkins gives his talk to people who really know neuroscience well, he starts out with the elaborate view, and they buy it. They know that he knows what he's talking about. But if he started out with this picture with a bunch of music students, they would not understand it, and they would be lost right from the beginning. The really fascinating thing, though, is that every time he gives a talk, regardless of which picture he started with, he moves to the other picture by the time it's done. Because this picture, the music students understand, over his talk, he takes them to this picture, and they get it. And they say, wow, isn't the human brain amazing? And with the neuroscientists, he starts with this picture, they get it, he takes them down through to the very basics, and he says, this is what we're building with our software, and they get it because he's established his credibility. You see the difference between same idea, same picture, it's even the same components, but the level of elaboration in there is really intriguing. Just from the perspective of comparing a qualitative to a quantitative picture, I'm kind of a space geek, and I've always imagined, qualitatively, what would it feel like to be on the moon? Well, I'm guessing it would probably be a little bit like bouncing on a trampoline. You have 1/6 your weight. But that doesn't really help someone who's trying to land on the moon. Now, if someone's going to land on the moon, they need a tremendous amount of quantitative information delivered to them really, really rapidly and with great accuracy so that they can parse it and understand exactly quantitatively how much fuel is left, what's my velocity vertically and horizontally, how much time have I got left, all these things. And so you end up with a complex instrument panel. So again, same concept, two completely different views. In the interest of saving time, I'm not going to really spend much time talking about some of these other pictures. Just really, really quickly, a visionary back of the napkin sketch, the logo of Bain & Company Consulting, is a little sketch that the chairman, Arit Gadish, who's actually the chairwoman, but she prefers to be called the chairman of Bain, drew when she had to give a big talk. She had to rally all the troops. Several years ago, 10, 15 years ago, Bain was in a very difficult position financially. Many of the consultants were getting ready to leave, and she was brought in to come up in what she called the no BS talk, to get all the consultants to understand that the company was going to change and it was going to do it in a positive way and it was going to have a real difference on what it meant to be a consultant at Bain. And she drew this picture, which is essentially a compass not pointing towards magnetic north, but pointing off to the side, pointing to true north. And the concept is this. Management consulting, in spite of what we in business would like to believe, is kind of a faddish business. It tends to follow whatever is the latest trend and the latest fad. And one of the things that she said was happening at Bain was that the company had lost its own sense of purpose because it was always trying to tack to magnetic north, which is what her husband's a sailor, and he was the one who had given her this idea. If you sail all the time just looking at the compass and never take into consideration the precession, the change of your compass as you move around the world, because guess what? The magnetic North Pole is not, in fact, located at the geographic North Pole of the Earth. You will eventually run into land. You will not be where you think you are. So what she wanted to indicate is we as a company, Bain & Company, will always focus on what we know to be our own true north and not be swayed by the swings of the compass. And it ended up, Bain is now considered one of the most successful management consulting companies. It's considered one of the most enjoyable to work for. And their logo is the little compass that's pointed slightly off from magnetic north. So that's a nice, very high concept, visionary picture. But let's face it, if you're in management consulting, what's the picture you use most of the time? You use a Gantt chart. Okay, how are we going to get there? That's great. Our vision is to go climb Mount Fuji. Well, that's fine, but which process, which step, which road, which train are we going to take to get there, and then what steps are we going to take to get up there? So the difference between vision and execution. I got a minute. Do you want to hear the Southwest Airlines story? Can I tell you really quickly the Southwest Airlines story? Most famous business napkin of all time. You probably, maybe many people know this story. Southwest Airlines was founded in 1967 by two guys sitting in a bar in San Antonio, Texas, Herb Kelleher and Rollin King. Now, it turns out that Rollin King had already run an airline. It was called Wild Goose Airlines. It was a charter airline for hunters in Texas, and it was a failure. Herb Kelleher was a lawyer from New York who had moved down to Texas and was the lawyer of Rollin King. King had hired Kelleher to help him shut down the failed Wild Goose Airlines. And they did all the business work, and they got all the paperwork done, and they shut it down. And that night, they went out to the St. Anthony's Club to have a drink. And when they were sitting there, Rollin King said to Herb, he said, "Thank you for shutting down my previous airline, but you know what? I have another idea for an airline." What would happen? And on a cocktail napkin, he drew the three cities of Dallas and Houston and San Antonio, and he connected them with a triangle. He said, if you think about Texas, Texas is pretty big, and Texas alone has got a lot of business people that need to travel between those three cities and only between those three cities. And it so happened that in 1967, if you wanted to fly to connect to those three cities, you could not do it on any one airline. Because of the way that the hub and spoke system was set up, you could fly on Braniff, or you could fly on Continental, or you could fly on Texas International, but you would never be able to just fly between those three cities, the three major cities. You would always have to go through Denver, or you'd have to go off through some other, through Phoenix or through Tucson or what have you, because you'd be part of hub and spoke. So he said, why don't we make an airline that just connects those three cities? And voila, Southwest Airlines was born, and it went on to become the most profitable airline in history, et cetera. It's all very nice. This napkin has become such a part of the lore of Southwest Airlines that if you actually go to southwest.com to book a ticket and you look under their history section, they have a nice little facsimile of the original napkin. And the thing that's also funny is that if you fly Southwest Airlines, they're the only airline I've seen that does this, and I've got to believe it's sort of in an homage to how they were founded. On the cocktail napkins that they hand out, they have the route map on the napkin. They're the only airline that does that. I think that's kind of clever. I'm going to skip the last one because we are running a bit out of time, and we have one more tool that we have to do. Remember I said there were 4 sets of blades around our Swiss Army knife, our universal problem-solving toolkit. The last one are 6 blades over here, 4, 5, 6, which I'm going to show you what they are about. It turns out that in order to draw any picture to solve any kind of problem, this is my theory, and I've run it by some neuroscientists, and they say, yeah, there's actually something there, just enough to be really dangerous, but it works for me, is that it turns out that neurologically and biologically, when we look at the world, the visual signal that's coming in is following a number of different vision pathways in our brain. And it turns out that we don't do vision processing in serial. Not surprisingly, we do it in parallel. And it turns out that one of the pathways, when I look at the world, what's happening with all of us right now, we all have exactly the same number of visual signals coming in. We all have them processing at exactly, or more or less, essentially exactly the same rate. It doesn't matter if I'm looking at you, you're looking at me, or if we're looking at a spreadsheet. The same number of neurons are being activated all the time. And one of the first things that we see when we look at the world is there's a path called, I love this scientific name, it's called the what pathway. It turns out that a big part of the visual signal, when it comes in, gets shunted off for processing solely of what I'm looking at, who and what I'm looking at. Doesn't matter where it is, it doesn't matter when it is, it doesn't matter how many of them there are, but part of me is saying, oh, there's Bob. Or one part of my process is saying, oh, there's a car, or oh, there's an apple. Now, it turns out that that is happening by a completely different pathway than the really lovely named where pathway. The where pathway says there's something out there 30 feet away from me and slightly below and to my right. It's processing all of the positions of all of the objects regardless of what those objects are. Now, another pathway is processing how many objects there are out there. And then an interesting thing happens, is as our vision system watches those who's and what's and the quantities of them change their where over time, we're actually seeing the process of time passing. We're seeing the when, if that makes any sense. And as we see enough whens, as we build enough understanding of how those things interact over time, we literally build an understanding of how the world works. And this is how, as infants, we learn to understand how the world works. It's by watching the same things happen over and over and over again till we build up an expectation that says, if I drop something, it's going to fall. A baby that's born doesn't know that. It learns that by seeing this object that's in this position now is now in that position down there. And if you do it enough times, eventually the baby doesn't have to think about it anymore, says things drop. Which leads us to the last big question, why do these things happen? And after we've built up enough understanding of hows, how does the world work, is when our mind starts to answer the question of why does the world work the way it does? Now, this is all kind of interesting and maybe a little bit esoteric, but here's the point. There are not hundreds of thousands of different drawings out there that we can do. You know, the fact is, if you look at Excel, it has some really nice chart manufacturing capabilities built into Excel. And when you take Excel out of the box, the latest version that I counted, it had 99 different charts that you could make. I don't believe that. There's essentially just a couple in there because what's really happening, there are not hundreds of pictures out there in the world. There are really only 6. We only see the world in 6 ways. There are only 6 pictures that we have the ability to make because they map back to how we have the ability to see. And it comes to this. If you can identify when you're facing your problem, whatever that problem might be, if you can identify what is the main aspect of this problem that interests me or is causing me concern, is it a political problem? If it's a political problem, it's probably about the who's and the what's. Is it a resource allocation problem? It's probably about the how muches. Is it about a project management problem, a timeline kind of a problem? When things have to happen, it's probably a when kind of a problem. The point of this is this. If you can identify fundamentally what is the core aspect of your problem, the picture that you would start with to represent that problem is a total no-brainer. And here's what it comes down to. There's only 6 pictures we need to know how to draw. If I'm facing a who and a what problem, I draw a portrait. Simple little portrait. If I'm facing a how much problem, I draw a chart. Purely quantitative. If I'm facing a where problem, I draw a map. A when problem, I draw a timeline. A how problem, I draw a flow chart. And a why problem, the mother of all problems, is a multivariable plot. Okay, so here's what I'd like you, if you believe any of this, what I'd like you to remember very quickly is, yes, there are lots of different versions of these, but it's really nice to know that when you face a problem, you already have a built-in tool to help you remember which picture would be the great picture to start with. And I kind of think about it as my 6 fingers, you know, trying to map these things together. If I've got a who, what, it goes to a portrait. If I've got a how much, it goes to a chart. Very simple little model. And here are some examples. Simple little portraits, problem-solving pictures for who and what problems. Simple little charts, problem-solving pictures for how much problems. Maps for where problems. Now, sometimes a map can be a geographic map. Sometimes a map can be a conceptual map. But think about this. What we're showing with this is, again, we're trying to show where things are located in space in relation to each other. We're not trying to show when they're located in relation to each other. We're not trying to show any sort of causality. We're not trying to show how. All we're trying to do is show what is the relationship of these items in space. And that's what a Venn diagram does as well. That's what a concept model does. That's what usually a schematic diagram does as well. Different, of course, than when we have a problem that's related to when. We have our timelines. And really, there's only one kind of timeline. I mean, a standard, and granted it is a Western cultural norm that is not necessarily followed by other cultures, but it makes a decent standard, is when you're making a timeline, start at the left, that's now, or the past, and just make it move to the right, and lay out your steps. We all know this. This is the basis of a Gantt chart. This is the basis of Microsoft Project. Just a little thing that I've noted is that a lot of people try to represent a life cycle in a circle. From a cognitive processing perspective, it's better to avoid that unless the point you want to make is that the aspect is cyclical, because it's very difficult for us to parse and understand a series of steps when they're drawn in a circle. It's better to just draw them linearly. Then, of course, a flow chart. We all know what a flow chart is. And last, of course, a multivariable plot, which is, in simple terms, all you're doing is you're taking multiple different types of data and you're mapping them together. And for what it's worth, the best example ever of a multiple variable chart that's out there, is anybody familiar with the TED conference? If you go to www.ted.com, TED.com, and watch one of the 2 clips about a guy named Hans Rosling. Hans Rosling is a genius. He's a guy who has access to all of the United Nations data about demographics and economic development and human health worldwide for essentially the last 60 to 100 years. He plots all of it together. You can actually look at this online at gapminder.org, I believe. There's a chart that you can play with. Spend some time because it's, or watch him give his presentation at TED, because we've all heard this. There will always be people who say, you know, I have the difficult job when it comes to presentations because I'm the guy who has to show the charts, and everybody falls asleep. If you watch Hans Rosling, you'll see that if you're the lucky person who gets to talk about the charts, you should always have the most entertaining part of any presentation because people do really want to look at visuals. Okay, there we have it. We are now done. We've created our Universal Visual Problem-Solving Toolkit. I hope that you were able to draw it on the back of your napkin. We are out of time, and I really appreciate your taking the time to come and listen to all of this, and thank you so much.